My name is Derek Todd, and I'm the Principal Coastal Hazard Scientist for Jacobs. I'm here today to talk to you about the coastal hazard science that has gone into the Takutai Kāpiti project to help define the extent of those coastal hazards and how we take that information through into adaptation planning. What I'm going to talk to you today is a little bit about the background to the hazard susceptibility and vulnerability reports that we've produced for the Takutai Kāpiti project, a little bit about explaining the coastal processes and sea level rise projections and their relevance to the Kāpiti coast, talk about the erosion and inundation modelling overview, how we've worked out the susceptibility and exposure to those hazards, give you a quick overview of the results of the hazard assessment, and then give you a very brief rundown on the adaptation areas and adaptation threshold triggers and signals going forward into the work that CAP is doing. So how we started to look at the Kāpiti coast is we broke it into 8 open coast cells, which are shown in red in our figure on the left over here. So each one of those cells have distinct morphologies, different exposure to hazards, different processes going on. So we looked at 8 different areas to work out for erosion how much the coast is changing and how much it might change in the future. There is also 10 inlets, which are shown in blue, where things are operating differently around the mouths of those inlets and streams. So they are handled slightly differently in the way that we assess what the long-term projections of shoreline future are. As well as that, there was 4 inundation cells, which aren't shown in this diagram, to look at what areas might get inundated with sea level rise behind the beach systems. So the coastal hazard susceptibility and vulnerability reports, there's been 2 of them that we've produced from Jacobs. The first one outlined the methodology for the hazard assessment, which was released in June of 2021. It uses the best science information that's available and the best practice to put it together into assessing coastal erosion and coastal inundation. So the hazards look at both current and future erosion and inundation due to the actions of the sea. So that's a combination of sea level and waves. So therefore, future sea level rise relative to the level of the land is a real major consideration in the assessment of future coastal hazards. Susceptibility is the likelihood of the hazard event occurring, so that it covers both the frequency of the occurrence, which has consideration of the duration and intensity of the event, the probability that that size event will occur, and then the spatial extent of the area that will be affected by either erosion or inundation within specified time frames into the future. So sea level rise in the future is a major driver of increasing susceptibility to hazard, because it increases both the frequency of those events occurring and the spatial extent of the area that is affected. The assessments recognise that the predictions are based on models, but the models aren't perfect predictors. They have limitations, so there is uncertainty in our results, and that is recognised in the way the models are done and how the results are presented. It's recognised in the Ministry of Environment guidelines in 2017 on how to assess coastal hazards, and we've followed that methodology through into these assessments. The approach that we've taken is also consistent with Policy 24 of the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statements, which were released in 2010. And that confirmation that we have followed those recommendations of the guidance and of the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement have recently been received from both MFE and DOC to the Kāpiti Coast Council. Now, the assessments used the most recent information available at the time, remembering that the work on these were done through 2020 and 2021, but recognises that there are data gaps. So that the data is not always being collected for sea level rise assessments, and in fact, most of it is being collected for other purposes. It also recognises that the data and the models will be updated as knowledge evolves. For example, sea level data has been updated from what was used in the report, and the projections have been updated by the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is an international panel of hundreds of scientists working on information, global information on what's happening with our climate and therefore what's happening with our sea levels. The New Zealand Sea Rise Program of 2021 updated that information, the new information from IPCC, and put it into a new coastal hazard guidance in 2022, an interim guidance on how councils and organisations should use that information. So these updates are not in these reports, but we have looked at those as part of an addendum to the Volume 2 report, which we produced last year in 2023, to see if they make a lot of difference or how significant are they in terms of differences to the results that we received. And both the methodology and the results were independently peer reviewed by coastal scientists from the Greater Wellington Regional Council and from Beckers. So we are very confident that the results that we've produced are the best available following best practice methodology. Okay, so the coastal processes operating on the Kāpiti coast. And we need to understand those processes, both of what's happened in the past and what's happening now, to understand what might change in the future with sea level rise. So if we start in the north, here sediment is delivered to the Kāpiti coast from 4 major river systems further north from Wanganui through to the Manawatu. And that sediment is supplied at around about an average rate of around 90,000 cubic metres a year. And it's moved south by these predominant northwest wave directions. So the material arrives along the Kāpiti coast. Then and what's happened is that this area in the north here has been accreting. So it's been building out, and over the last 6,000 to 7,000 years that we've seen that coastal plain build out around 2 to 4 kilometres. But as we get down towards Kāpiti Island, we get in this wave shadow behind the island, and the material starts to get deposited at a greater rate, and we end with this cuspit foreland that is in around here, around Paraparaumu. So the shoreline has gone out further because there is not the same wave energy to drive it further south. And as a result, that we've ended up with beach erosion and very large storm events which occur. They've been very damaging, and so we end up with a long-term erosion down through Rāmati through to Paikokariki once we get out of the shadow, because the sediment is not available to drive that accretion. And so that coastal plain is very narrow there. It's around 100 to 200 metres wide, as opposed to the 2 to 4 kilometres in the north. Now, the rivers within Kāpiti themselves don't provide a lot of sediment. The Otaki provides predominantly gravel to a very narrow area just to the south at around 11,000 cubic metres a year. And the Waikanae provides around 5,000 cubic metres of sand. So we can see that most of our sediment is derived from up north, trucks south, gets caught in the wave shadow, and leaves us with a sediment shortage in our southern areas. So relative sea level rise. So it's a combination of climate change sea level rise and vertical land movements, commonly called VLMs. So climate change sea level rise is an increase in the sea level due to thermal extension of the oceans with increased temperature, and a contribution of increased ice melt from those warmer temperatures. So we can see that our current sea level down here, it goes up with that climate change. But then the land is also moving relative to the sea. And at Kāpiti, we have the Pacific plate slipping under the Australian plate. So the land is subsiding. It's actually going down. So our relative sea level rise is increasing And this adds this extra piece of component of sea level rise here. So situations in Kāpiti are worse than, say, situations in Kaikoura, where their land is uplifted in a series of earthquakes. So sea level rise, relative sea level rise, is not as great. So climate change is quite global, and how seas will respond, and very much national will be very similar. Vertical land movements are very, very local, and so they will vary the relative rates in very local in short distances. So what does relative sea level rise look like for Kāpiti? When we did our first assessment in 2022, and the results in the Jacobs results report are these black squares here. So we looked at 3 time scales. We looked at the rise from 2020 through to 2050 in the next 30 odd years, and those ranges are between 0.2 to 0.4, depending on which scenario of climate change you use and which rate of vertical land movement you use, with the rates being taken between 1 millimetre a year and 3 millimetre a year, and I'll speak a little bit more about those in a moment. When we come through to 2070, we could have potential rates between 0.3 to 0.7, and when we come through to 2120, anywhere between 0.6 through to 1.65. As we said, there's been updates and changes since that assessment to relative sea level rise. The first of those is that the new IPCC work in 2021 changed the way that they assess scenarios from an old what's called an RCP scenario, to a new SSP, a shared social economic pathway, which relates to both political will within the world to change climate and world populations, and how much energy and consumption and releasing therefore emissions of carbon. And so they changed a little bit. They sort of came down a little bit in the near future, but increased a little bit in the far future. The New Zealand Sea Level Rise Program, which was released after that new IPCC update, so it was released in late 2021, early 2022, then looked at new data around 10 years of data around how vertical land movements have moved within 2 kilometre intervals, so a very quite dense spatial network. Before that, with our work in the Jacobs reports, we had used just 3 sites along the Kāpiti to Horowhenua coast, and they had ranges of vertical land movements of between 1 millimetre a year to 3 millimetres a year. So they were added to the climate change. The new data looks at 21, gives 21 sites along the Kāpiti coast, and they range between 0.8 millimetres a year of subsidence to 1.4 millimetres a year of subsidence. So the 3 millimetre one is now no longer considered credible for Kāpiti. And so in our work to look at risk assessments and look at adaptation, we have put them all down. We've assessed vertical land movement all at 1 millimetre a year. Okay, so we can see that there's been a reduction in our rates. Similarly, this upper scenario that was considered credible and should be used in the MFE guidance of 217 of using this SSP or RCP as it was at that time, 8.5 plus scenario, so 83rd percentile of the 8.5 climate change, is now not considered in the work that's come out and the guidance that's come out around adaptation, that our upper scenario should just be this 8.5 scenario in here. So these upper ones are now being dropped out of the risk assessments and adaptation work. And so what we're left with is the red triangles. So that going forward, the work to assess sea level rise is a 0.2 rise by 2050, and that's under both an 8.5 and a 4.5 scenario. Somewhere between 0.35 and 0.45 by 2070. You can see that the difference in the climate change scenarios are now starting to have a difference in the amount of sea level rise. The additional carbon emissions are starting to drive sea level rise up more than what it is under the 4.5, which is a much more middle of the road scenario around climate increasing at a slower rate, and that it's slowing down in the later part of the 21st century. And then when we push out to 2130, our rates now that we assess going forward of sea level rise are around 0.85 up to a maximum of 1.25 meters of sea level rise over the next 100 years, which is a little different than what it was previously at 1.65. So that's the amounts of sea level rise that we put into the models to look at both how the beach responds to those in terms of erosion and how much inundation that might cause along the coast, coming up our rivers and streams and overtopping our beach systems. So here's a quick comparison between those rates of sea level rise that were in the Jacobs 2022 report, that results report, and what's now in the addendum and move forward going into the risk assessments and adaptation pathways development. And as you can see, there's a change in the scenarios used and a change in the amount of vertical land movement that's been applied. So as I've noted, that the work and the modelling and the predictions and scenarios used follow guidance and best practice, and this gives the list of those that come out from government departments around that guidance that we should be using. And as I said at the start, that has been tested back with the Ministry of Environment and the Department of Conservation, and they have both come back saying yes, all the appropriate guidance and levels have been used, and that this is a critical piece of work in using those correct scenarios and projections going forward. So how do we assess coastal erosion? How do we model it to go forward? So this formula over here on the right is CED is coastal erosion distance. And if we think about it in the present day and just what could happen anytime tomorrow, next week, next year, the next few years, is really what happens with storms. And so that is a combination of two factors, the short-term storm factor and a dune stability factor. So the short term is where we have a storm that comes up, attacks our dune toe, and therefore removes parts of the dune. And so our modelling is, what is this distance in here? And we're left with an over-steepened dune face, a scarp face, and then to meet the angle of repose of natural sand, when they're exposed like that, then there will be a further part of erosion to reach back to that 30-odd degrees angle of repose from an over-steepened 40 degrees. So this amount of erosion in our present day is based on what we know in the past, what storms might have occurred that have created these issues. Now, the largest storm on record for Kāpiti Coast was September 1976. It had a combined water level and wave frequency of around 1 in 200 years. So its probability of occurring in any 1 year is 0.5. So that's its annual exceedance probability. And they have a return period of around 200 years. So we would expect one of these every 200 years. So a very large storm. It eroded 6 to 10 meters off the dunes where there was no protection. And where there was a protection that was overtopped and failed, those erosion distances were up to 15 meters. Right, and that's because of the way that those structures interact with the beach. because we can see some beach lowering occurred. So that's the first part of our modelling. What could happen in the present day? Then we look at what could happen in the future. And so to those present day assessments, those present day factors of dune stability in the short-term storms, we need to add what's happening in the long term, and then what is the effect of sea level rise on those long-term processes and long-term rates of shoreline movement. So in our long term, how we measure that is we look at aerial photography and look at where the beach was relative to where it is now, and look at different rates at very tight density of around every 50 to 100 metres along the coast. And those aerial photos go back 70 odd years. So we're looking at what is the rate of change over the last 70 years, and then extrapolate that to the future. So as we see it in that northern part of the district, north of Kāpiti Island, which is still receiving sand, it's there is more supply than is lost. So there's the movement south, there's more arrives from the north than is lost to the south. So that extrapolation of long-term rate is a continual extrapolation of accretion, of building out of the beach. But then when we look at the effect of sea level rise, what sea level rise will do is it removes material from a beach system, places it out here in the near shore, because what it's trying to do is equalize these distances, these depths here, that they remain the same as what they are now. And the only way it can do that is add material to the near shore. The only place it can get that material is off the beach system. So to keep those internal equilibriums, material is eroded from our beach, the profile goes backwards and up, and so we end up with a new shoreline position. And so what happens is that for those northern beaches where we had accretion, at some stage in the future, the effect of sea level rise, as the rate of it increases through time, and the magnitude of it increases through time, will override those accretional factors, and those beaches at some stage in the future will turn into erosional beaches. And it's a matter of when that occurs, how much sea level rise does that need. But if we look at the southern beaches, south of Kāpiti Island, the ones in Rāmati and Paikakariki, they are already eroding. There is already insufficient sediment supply to keep them in the current place. And that will continue in the future. And those processes will change. And so the effect of sea level rise will add to that. So the erosion distances will get greater. Then we could still have our short-term storms. They will still occur. We will still get very extreme storms, and we will still get those failures occurring. So all of that goes to create our coastal erosion distance in the future. So it's a combination of the long term, the sea level, the short term, and the dune stability. Now, for a number of your beaches, particularly those at Rāmati and Paikakariki, they are protected by structures to stop erosion. In the short term, they can fail. And that's indeed what happened in 1976. So at some stage, at some time, we could expect to get storms which will be larger than the design for the structure, and they'll either scour the toe of the beach, like in here, below the structure, leading to failure, or combined water levels and waves will come over the beach and scour the material out the back, leading in failure. So how we have looked at that is in our projections in the present day, is we make those projections as if these structures have failed. So if they fail, what is our worst case storm? And again, that's based on what happened in September 1976. And if we look at the long-term future of these structures and trying to predict or project where shorelines might be, what we've done is taken the design life of those structures, which was assessed in 2017 by Tonkin and Taylor, and they had design lives given their condition and their ages of between 10 years and 50 years, so they would fail if nothing was done to them in those time periods. What we've done is taken those time periods and said, okay, up until then, we don't have our long term. we don't have an effective sea level, but after they fail, then those processes can reinitiate. It is that we don't, in those assessments, we don't include that a consideration of the walls being rebuilt, because those are decisions that are still to be made and decisions that come out of the adaptation work. So this is very much a worst case scenario. If walls fail, nothing else is done, so they fail at various times in the future, then where will our shorelines be? And so again, those predictions have a reinitiation of a long-term erosion rate, assessment of what the effective sea level rise will be at that stage in the future, and then still adding our short-term storm. Okay, so that explains how we've modelled and how we've arrived at coastal erosion distances in the future and where we think projected shorelines will be. If we look at coastal flooding, the other major hazard, what we look at is what is the water level that might happen if we have an extreme sea level. So that sea level is what's called an extreme sea level. It comes from a storm tide. That storm tide is a combination of astronomical tides and storm surge. And so that pushes our water levels up. We also then have waves that set up as waves arrive at the shore. The water level is set up. It's not the wave height itself, but the water level under the wave increases in what's called wave setup. And then we look at sea level rise and how much might that occur in the future, and looking at those projections that we've already presented. And the storm probability that we look at is a 1% annual exceedance probability, so that it has 1% of occurring every year or in any year. So its return period, if you like, is what's commonly called a 1 in 100-year event. So a pretty extreme event. And in this situation that we have here, that water level, which for Kāpiti is calculated to be 3.96 metres in terms of the Wellington vertical datum. So that's all your land datums that you have. So an elevation of 3.96 RL. If the beach was lower than that, we get inundation of the area behind, which is normally an old beach swale. And if there's structures and buildings lower than that elevation, then they would be inundated. It's very much, it's a bathtub model. Excuse me. So it just takes the static water level. It doesn't look at what any of the hydrodynamic processes are. It's a very simplistic model. We've also got situations which are more common where the dune or the beach crest itself is higher. So we don't get that direct overtopping of water, but water is able to get into these lower areas and behind via drainage pipes, outfalls, etc. That push that water level also up. So the model, as a simplistic bathtub model, says those areas are below what that static sea level is, so therefore they could also potentially be inundated. And then we look at the third way that inundation can occur, which adds to that static water level, is in the cases where the dune crest is there, but the wave run-up itself, when we have these large wave events, can run up and over the dune system and adding water into this ponded area and behind. All right, so again, causing potential inundation. So that's the way that we have modelled how coastal inundation will occur. And remembering we're worried in this, we're only interested in this study about coastal inundation from raised sea levels in the future. And of course, as sea level rise goes up, these levels on the seaside also go up, and so therefore the amount of water that is in these flooded areas also increases. It is not looking at the fluvial flooding coming down our rivers and our groundwater flooding, which increases the groundwater below where sea level rise will increase the groundwater levels below and impede drainage. That's a separate study that has been undertaken by a different group. So how have we looked at that? How have we then put all this information together to look at how we might adapt and what are called adaptation pathways, and which are really how we might manage these coastal hazards as they evolve and get worse over the next 100 odd years? What sort of actions might we take? So we've taken our results from those 8 different open coast areas, the 4 different inundation areas, and those river mouths, and we've looked at was there similarities between them, to put them into bigger units to consider the actions. And what we've come up with is 5 adaptation areas, as we can see here. A northern area really stretching from Otaki to between Waikanae and Pekapeka, a central area from that boundary down into past the edge of the Cuspit Foreland and Paraparaumu, then the Ramati area, which is really seawall protected, Queen Elizabeth Park, where there is really under the control of DOC and Greater Wellington, so Kāpiti district doesn't have a great influence on how management is done there, and then the southern area of Paikokariki. As you can see, the landward boundary of these assessment areas is not linear. It goes in and out, and that's related to how far inland those coastal processes might occur. So for the northern area and through into Waikanae, this boundary represents the landward limit of where that coastal inundation could occur. So there is no land in those areas or landward of those areas that are below that 3.96 metre elevation. So coastal inundation, whether it comes over the beaches, runs up our rivers, etc., is not likely or very unlikely to affect flooding. Now, flooding could still occur, as we said, from our river systems, like the Otaki, from small catchments. We may have drainage issues, but they will not be influenced by sea level rise. When we come to the south, they are really where the influence of groundwater on water levels, where raised sea level influence of groundwater, is limited. So that again, there could be inundation from the river systems and streams, but it will not be influenced by sea level rise. Okay, so they are the assessment areas. They are not necessarily the areas that where the exposure from hazard occurs, but beyond that, we're very confident it will not occur. So let's look at some of the erosion results then given by those 5 areas. And so as we can see in each of the areas, we've got the 2 scenarios, the 4.5 middle of the road scenario, and then an 8.5, an upper scenario of climate change, which is really is a continuation of fossil fuels dependent futures and sea level and climate increasing to around 4 degrees by 2100. Okay, and this is the total number, then this column here is the total number of properties in those adaptation areas. Then in the last 4 columns are the numbers of those properties that might be affected by coastal erosion under each of those scenarios at our 4 time periods. So in the present day, if we looked at that northern area, the storms, when we had those very large storms, we could have 3 properties affected, right? When we come down to Ramati, we could have 249 properties. And these are properties, not dwellings. So they are just where there is a private land parcel. It doesn't automatically say that the dwelling on that property will also be affected. And as we can see, those numbers increase through time as sea level rise goes up and as the amount of erosion increases. We can see the differences in the rates of increase. So in this northern area, for example, around Otaki, the erosion rates are quite low, 13 metres by 2050, 14 to 22 metres by 2070, 22 to 55 metres by 2130. and similar and slightly higher for Tohoro and Pekapeka. And that's because those areas will continue to receive sediment at a higher rate than it is lost until some stage in the future when sea level rise, the increased rates of sea level rise trigger across that we end up with total erosion rather than small amounts of accretion. And as you can see, they'll start to occur in through this 2050 sort of period. When we come down to the south, though, our amount of properties are much higher. The rate of increase is much higher, and that's reflected in that it is a more higher density urban areas, particularly at Ramati and a little less so at Paikokariki. But also that those erosion distances are much greater because the long-term rate, it's already eroding in the long term, and therefore the sea level rise adds to that to give us greater erosion distances. In terms of inundation, we have the same number of properties in the assessment area, but the reverse trend, the greatest risk of inundation to those properties is in the north, because we have a lower beach system that can be overtopped. So we get that when we have very high water levels and very large waves, and therefore sea level rise means that frequency and exposure and depths is greater. So we have much higher numbers potentially affected by inundation. Indeed, in this northern area, we can see something like over 1,000 properties out of 2,000 in the assessment area. And similarly in the central area, potentially by 2130, 2,200 out of 7,000 in those assessment areas. But when we come down to Ramati and Paikokariki, the risk is less, and that's because the beaches are higher, and our inundation risk is really limited to around those streams and inlets, and how the increased water level around the mouths and lower catchments or lower streams or lengths of streams in those areas would occur. And in fact, in Paikokariki, it's actually very low, right, because we have that big high dune system that can't get overtopped. Then how have we taken that forward to look at what management options or which pathways for adaptation to these increasing hazards in the future might occur? So what we've done is split those 5 adaptation areas into smaller, what we've called management units. And the size of those management units are based on the hazard that is there, the boundaries of settlements and areas. So tried not to lump urban and rural areas together, kept them as separate units, because the way that we might adapt, the actions we might take would be different in those areas. We've tried to keep areas of common risk together, so the amounts of erosion or inundation. And we've looked at where there's differences in the current management regime. So we haven't lumped together areas that have current protection with those that haven't got protection. So each of those 5 units has been broken up into a number of smaller management units, and this is the one for that central area. As we can see, we've got a Waitanai Beach coastal erosion component and a Paraparaumu coastal erosion component, because the pathways dealing with coastal erosion will be different and how we manage it compared to those that deal with inundation, which are these much larger areas in behind. And we have this special unit around the mouth of the Waitanai River, where inundation and erosion of those stream banks are linked, and an area of just inundation in behind. So there's something like 22 management units falling out of the 5 adaptation areas. Then we've developed a pathway of management, or number of pathways of potential management across each of those management units. So this is one for the inundation area at Waitanai, all right? And so in those pathways, we've looked at what actions might you take in a short-term time epoch, what you might take in a medium-term epoch, and what you might take in a long-term. And which ones then they are scored by a multi-criteria analysis as to which ones are going to be most effective, which ones might have the greatest impacts on things like ecology, landscape, social impacts, and cultural impacts. And so that they end up being ranked as in what is the best pathway going forward. Then we also need to look at when do we change from one action to a next action? When does that need to occur? And what is it? It is how a beach will respond, or the amount of flooding that will occur when we come to meet some threshold which the community do not find acceptable, as in the amount of flooding that occurs, or the frequency of flooding that occurs, or how close the coast is to them in terms of erosion. And so they then become what our thresholds are when we need to move to another action to maintain a level of service. But we need to know what the triggers are for those thresholds. We need to know that we're approaching them, and we need to know what the signals are that we're measuring to be able to manage it effectively rather than in a proactive way, rather than just being reactive. And so that's what we call our adaptation thresholds, triggers, and signals. So the adaptation threshold, if we read this from right to left, is when our level of hazard gets to a level of it that is unacceptable. And as we said, that it's that the current protection is no longer, or current way of managing is no longer meeting the community needs, the community values, or an agreed level of service. We then need to step back from that a time for us to implement the changes in the action, because if we waited to the time when the threshold was exceeded, then we become reactionary and we end up having a lot of damage potentially if it's to do with storms or flooding, and so the costs are pushed in another way, where if we act early, we can limit those costs. So each action will have a different trigger, or the different time that's needed, so therefore a different trigger. So things carrying on doing things like planting, putting in new flat gates, etc., take very little lead-in time. They don't need a lot of financial work put into them. They don't need a lot of consenting. They don't take a lot to implement. Where something like physical structures can take a lot longer to get the necessary consents, do the necessary design, raise the necessary capital through whatever mechanisms might be required for that, or things like relocating infrastructure need much greater time. So relocating where our wastewater treatment plants might be, or outfalls, or pipe networks or road networks might be, take longer time. So those are the things that we need to identify. When do we need to start work? And they then become our triggers. And our signals are a group of signals that tell us that we are approaching that time that we need to take some sort of action. They're an early warning device. So when you hear the words around thresholds, triggers, and signals, this is the process or the way that we go through to know when we change action. So if sea level rise occurred much slower than what the predictions are, we don't need to act as early. But if sea level occurs much quicker and the responses to the beach systems or to the flooding occurs much quicker than what's projected, we need to act sooner, so that we've got a mechanism of knowing when that might occur. And that's the way that we deal with the uncertainty around the predictions of sea level rise and beach response. And that's why sea level rise itself as a single variable is not a good trigger, because it's how the beach is responding, or how the amount of flooding is responding, and how the community value that or view that as risk and hazard, which are important. Okay, and I think that's the end. Thank you very much for listening.